What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 of my favorite choices in gaming, because as a channel that covers RPGs pretty much exclusively, I talk quite a bit about choice and consequence, though I did recently realize that I had not actually made a video like this, despite making lists all the time about basically everything. Somehow, this one had slipped under the radar. So today I'd like to take the opportunity to speak a little more specifically about some of my favorite choices in games that are laden with choice and consequence. With that in mind, I will say 1 or 2 of these is a little bit broad just due to the nature of the choice itself. So with that out of the way, let's dive into it, starting with the almost obligatory Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous entry, one of my favorite games period, putting us on the adventure path of the tabletop known as Wrath of the Righteous, where we lead a crusade against the demonic armies of the world wound, naturally lends itself to a lot of choices, but by far, I would say the biggest system, the biggest selling point, and the biggest choice you'll make in that game has to do with your mythic path. Not just content to be a powerful mortal all on your own, you have the opportunity in this game to take up the mythic path, or the opportunity to be much more than a mortal, by tapping into various power sources, such as that of a lich, an angel, a demon, and while that's pretty cool in and of itself, the best part about this choice is really what it does for the gameplay, as most of these mythic paths come with dedicated storylines that show you exclusive content to that path that if you want to see another version of, you'll have to reload back to at least when you picked the mythic path, and that's to say nothing of unlocking them as options in the first place, as you'll have to play through a good chunk of the game before you can even take your first step on that route. Which is truly just the beginning, because initially, provided you've unlocked them all, you'll have a choice of 2 to 6 of these options, which will carry you through most of the game and give you a lot of that exclusive story content. And then later on, much later on, in fact, in the game, you'll have the option to reaffirm the path you're already on, or potentially branch out into one of the late game mythic paths, which are things like a gold dragon, a devil, a swarm that walks, or simply a legend, a truly powerful mortal who is just that, a legend. And while those later game paths certainly lack a lot of the substantial story content of the main paths, I would say, in a game as massive as Wrath of the Righteous, anything that offers that unique experience with all sorts of choices to be made and parsed through, of course, has my attention, and it's, I would say overall, one of my favorite things about one of my favorite games, as they each can offer a pretty unique experience. But that brings us right along to our number 2 entry, this time with Tyranny. Now, Tyranny is one of my favorite CRPGs, and often when I talk about it, you'll hear me praise its unique spellcrafting system that I think is marvelously well done. But that's not what we're here to talk about today, as Tyranny is a game from Obsidian, a studio known for their choice and consequence in many of their titles, and Tyranny is certainly no exception. And the choice here is simply which faction do you side with or play through the game with. If you're unfamiliar with the title, it's possible after Act 1 to dedicate yourself to one of the factions of the game, such as the Scarlet Chorus or the Disfavored. Both of those factions serve Kairos, the Overlord, whose will you have invaded a land to enact, but it's not the only option. You can also side with the rebels, or you could even go your own way. And each of those options offers a unique path through the game from different perspectives, and while I would say that's pretty standard in a lot of ways, what I actually enjoy most about it is what happens later. You see, while following any of those individual paths, you might think you're locked into them, but that's not true. At certain points, the game will then offer up the opportunity to break your allegiance to that faction and switch sides to another one with a sort of mid-game ship jumping, which adds just that little bit extra if you've been playing along with the faction and suddenly decide that you don't like it very much. And I think that's just one of many reasons Tyranny is overall just such a great title, and that's to say nothing of its incredible spellcrafting system. Though that does bring us to our 3rd entry, with The Witcher 2. The Witcher 2 is a game rife with choice and consequence, as it has 16 different endings based on said choices. I've talked about it a decent bit in my old review for that title, but there is one particular choice I want to hone in on for the sake of this video, and that comes at the end of Act 1, where you have to choose between helping Yorvith or Roach, which then sets the stage for the rest of the game by completely altering Act 2 based on your decision and then leading to an Act 3 that culminates from all of your choices based on everything up to that point. But the choice between those two incredible characters, which honestly in and of itself is a difficult decision, they're both laden with their own pros and cons to be sure, but then you add to that the fact that Act 2 will be quite literally different in its entirety based on what you choose here, with each of them having a different act or a side to an upcoming battle even, that lends host to just tons of exclusive missable content, was just really fantastic, and that's just one choice of many. But what I like the most about this specifically is simply that they had the courage, let's call it, to completely lock off half of the content in Act 2 based on your choice here. And while there is a little bit of overlap, for the most part it's a unique experience where you can learn different things on each side of it, instead of simply giving you the same content, slightly repackaged in the way a lot of other games do. Which is why, for all its faults, I really do enjoy The Witcher 2, if only for its story and the choices in it. But that does of course bring us to number 4 on the list. This one being a little more ambiguous with Alpha Protocol, and what I like most about this game is that almost everything you do is a choice. But Alpha Protocol is a spy thriller of sorts, also from Obsidian, though coincidentally Alpha Protocol is not available to buy digitally anymore. You can still get your hands on a physical copy if you happen to have hardware that can run it. Otherwise you'll have to resort to piracy, as again it's not something you can get your hands on these days, which has to do with some music licenses if you're wondering. That said, Alpha Protocol blends traditional RPG elements with a spy thriller, of course, but what makes this really unique is just how ambitious it was with a lot of the choice and consequence. You see, the game has several different hubs around the world for which you'll take on missions, each of which handles part of the story naturally, but the order in which you do these, which also lends you the ability to say do one mission in one part of the world, leave completely and go do one in another area, only to then come back, etc., all affects how the game itself plays out. And while for the most part stuff like that won't have a gigantic difference, it does make a difference. But another big part of the choice and consequence here is how you speak to people. You see, as a spy, your job ultimately tends to be getting information out of people, which can be done a few different ways, with each character responding differently to different approaches. As being kind and chatty with one person might not actually get you the answers you need, as opposed to taking a hard line with them. Kind of leaning into that spy aspect where you're effectively just trying to worm your way into their good graces to learn what you want to learn. And those two systems combined make, I would say, one of the most convoluted maps of choice and consequence I have ever seen, and in fact, because the game is difficult to come by these days, I can't even find a consistent determination of how many endings there are exactly. And while you can divide the game up into a few general endings, each of those endings has tons of variations based on choices you did or did not make throughout the story. So for this game, it's pretty hard to nail down any one specific choice, but I would say it's the two systems of choices that get me the most. The approach you take to talking to individuals and then later on to spare or kill them in a lot of instances, and then the order in which you do the missions on top of that to further complicate things. It was a wildly ambitious system that, quite frankly, didn't really wind up working out in a lot of ways, as the game has many problems, but it did this thing very, very well. Which does, though, bring us to our final entry with none other than the ending for Divinity Original Sin 2. Obviously, this is going to be very heavy with spoilers on this one, but for those who have been with the channel for quite some time, I love the Divinity series, not just Original Sin 2, but the entire thing. I covered it extensively with tons of lore videos. It is easily one of my favorite universes out there in video games. So when you get to the ending of Divinity Original Sin 2 in particular, I love what they did here because it's a situation that is very, very gray morality-wise. There's a lot of outcomes. There's hardly any of them that are satisfying completely. Some benefit your character personally, but are a detriment to the rest of the world. There are choices that benefit the world greatly, but are of great detriment to you specifically. And unfortunately, with the follow-up game, Divinity Fallen Fallen Heroes having been officially cancelled after the release of BG3, this was confirmed, we likely won't necessarily ever see specific answers to a lot of these questions, but given that Divinity 2 is technically a sequel farther out from Divinity Original Sin 2, we kind of know where some of this stuff has to go if they don't choose to disregard that game as canon since it is so old. But the ending of Original Sin 2 sees you finally confronting Lucian the Divine, having found out that he is in fact alive, despite the many reports to the contrary, and he's not only alive, he's actively the cause of most of the world's problems in one way or another. Problems he fully admits to, mistakes he knows he's made, and in a bizarre crusade to correct them, he's basically killing and massacring millions of people to implement a final protection against the oncoming Void, and thus the God King and the Voidwoken. And after a fight, no matter what you choose in the initial conversation, you'll eventually have the option to choose what happens next. You can ascend to Divinity, as has been your goal for the entire game. You can go along with Lucian's plan, which is to purge the entire world of Source, the magic source that fuels a lot of these issues, which is of great benefit to the entire planet, but is supposed to cause your character specifically a horrendous fate, that of a silent monk, though that doesn't exactly wind up happening. But even though you're spared that fate, you still lose all your power. Another option is to share Source with everyone in a sort of if everyone's special, no one is kind of way, but even that comes with its own issues and problems. You can also make a deal with the devil, quite literally, which causes a unique kind of terrible ending. That's I would say the worst one, actually. But I really do love the final choice of Original Sin 2 because it is such a difficult one. The outcomes are substantial, not to mention all the work you've put into getting up to that point, especially if you played it on launch when the last act was a nightmare. But I really loved that none of the choices, I would say, were 100% good or 100% bad in most instances, outside of the one that's the deal with the devil, which is pretty much just 100% bad. Most of these options are simply gray. There's not necessarily a correct answer or one that solves everyone's problems. And perhaps most painfully of all, canonically, because he appears in Divinity 2, which takes place about 60 years after Original Sin 2, Lucian survives this encounter, which is hardly the fitting end that this character deserves after the many terrible, monstrously horrific things they've done, because while you can certainly kill him in-game, at least at the time of this video, provided they don't retcon it, it definitely seems like he gets to walk away from all this bloodshed, remaining the character with the most blood on his own hands. But to put it simply, there are very few games and very few choices in games that have made me stop and think about the reasoning and implications of said choice as the ending to Original Sin 2, and in many ways it's why all those lore videos exist. But that, I think, is going to do it for today. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think about these choices and many more down in the comment section below, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.